Right now, the world's most advanced artificial intelligence models are, uh, they're quietly suffocating.
Yeah, they really are.
I mean, they aren't running out of training data, and they aren't running out of silicon chips. They're hitting a much harder, much older physical wall. They're, running out of water and electricity.
Right. The absolute fundamentals.
Exactly. And the solution to this bottleneck, which is arguably the bottleneck that will define the 21st century, it isn't being drawn up in a boardroom in Silicon Valley. It's buried under the snow, in the steep, fractured rock of the highest mountains on Earth.
It forces us to completely, redraw our mental map of global power. I mean, the 20th century map was built on oil fields, right?
Yeah.
Warm water ports and control over physical shipping lanes like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca.
Right, it was very horizontal.
Exactly, a flat, horizontal view of extraction and logistics. But what we are analyzing today flips that map vertically. We are looking at topographical gradients, sheer drops in elevation, and the freezing thin air of the Himalayas.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a fascinating blueprint today, and honestly, it is one of the most audacious proposals we have ever unpacked.
Oh, absolutely. It's massive.
We are looking at a highly detailed, deeply technical, and incredibly visionary text dated June 9, 2026. It's authored by a prolific writer named Paramendra. The piece is titled Himalayan Compute, 10 Years to a Trillion, a Global Vision for Himalayan AI Power.
Ooh, quite a title.
Yeah, and the author frames this right out of the gate with an incredibly striking thought, that the age of abundance was prophesied in ancient scriptures thousands of years ago, and we are now actually witnessing its technological manifestation.
And that framing, it sets the scale of the ambition immediately. I mean, Paramendra isn't simply pitching a corporate expansion here. He is outlining a civilizational leap.
Yeah, totally.
When you read his other listed works, which consistently touch on, trillion-dollar valuations, the mechanics of AI, and futuristic macroeconomics, you see a mind that operates primarily at the sovereign level.
Right.
This Himalayan Compute blueprint is a massive multinational infrastructure proposal. It claims it can build a trillion-dollar AI platform within a single decade, not by creating a new software paradigm, but by fundamentally reorganizing the physical resources of 3 distinct regions.
So the text proposes a specific geographical and economic triad.
Yes,
Right?
exactly. 3 pillars.
We are talking about combining the raw, untapped geography of Nepal, the massive, heavy engineering muscle and policy framework of India, and the immense, patient, sovereign wealth of the United Arab Emirates.
The ultimate cocktail.
Right. And just to set the expectations for you, the listener, this is not a startup looking for seed money to build a generative AI app. The text explicitly describes this project as a hybrid. It's like part national utility company, part tech hyperscaler, and part aerospace pioneer.
Yeah, it is a roadmap for a trillion-dollar endgame.
So before we can even talk about the trillion-dollar endgame, we have to look at the immediate crisis Himalayan Compute is trying to solve.
Which is the bottomless hunger of AI.
Right. To understand why that trillion-dollar valuation isn't just hyperbole, we have to look at the immediate physical crisis. The core driver of everything in this document is, well, explosive global demand.
As we transition from localized software applications into the era of large language models, multimodal generative AI, and especially autonomous agentic AI, the computing power required doesn't scale linearly.
It scales exponentially.
Exactly. It scales exponentially. And computing power is fundamentally electrical power.
You rack tens of thousands of these massive GPUs together in a single facility, you run them at maximum capacity, and they just drain the local grid.
They absolutely devour it.
We are seeing municipalities in the U.S. and Europe already pushing back on new data center permits because there simply isn't enough juice in the wires to keep the lights on for residential neighborhoods and power these server farms simultaneously.
That is the structural bottleneck right there. And this is where the specific geography of Nepal becomes the most valuable asset in the equation. The text lays out some staggering numbers regarding theoretical and viable power generation.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
Nepal possesses a theoretical hydropower potential of roughly 83,000 megawatts.
Wait, 83,000?
83,000. Out of that theoretical total, about 40,000 to 50,000 megawatts are economically viable to develop right now using current engineering standards.
Let me stop you there because we need to contextualize that number for you listening. 50,000 viable megawatts. To give that some scale, a single gigawatt, which is 1,000 megawatts, can power a mid-sized city.
Right.
So we are talking about the potential to power 50 massive cities. But the reality on the ground is completely different, isn't it?
Completely different. The text notes Nepal's current installed capacity remains under 4,000 megawatts.
Under 4,000.
Yeah, they're tapping into less than 10% of their economically viable water power.
So it is a mass stranded asset.
Exactly. Himalayan Compute targets a transformative build-out to capture that remaining 40,000 to 50,000 megawatts. But the genius of the geographical play isn't just the raw volume of energy.
Right, it's the kind of energy.
Yes. It's the specific quality of that energy and why hydropower is uniquely suited for the physics of AI training.
I think the natural question you, the listener, might have is, if we need massive amounts of clean energy, why go through the nightmare of building in the Himalayas?
Right, it seems overly complicated.
Yeah. Why not just pave a desert in Nevada or North Africa with solar panels?
It comes down to the mechanics of how artificial intelligence models are actually trained. An AI training run isn't a task you can pause and resume easily.
You can't just hit save and come back tomorrow.
No, not at all. To run a massive cluster of tens of thousands of GPUs efficiently, you need what the energy grid industry calls firm, renewable baseload power.
Firm baseload power.
Exactly. The cluster must run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a time without a single microsecond of voltage drop. If a training run crashes due to power instability, you lose valuable computation time and the financial cost runs into the millions.
Because solar and wind are intermittent. I mean, the sun sets, the wind dies down, and suddenly your generation curve drops off a cliff. Right. If you are relying on solar for a massive AI data center, you have to build unimaginably huge battery storage facilities just to bridge the gap through the night, which destroys the economics of the facility.
That is the crux of the issue. Hydropower delivers high-capacity, firm, continuous energy. A river, fed by glacial melt and seasonal monsoons in a steep topographical gradient, provides immense kinetic energy around the clock.
It just keeps flowing.
And the spinning mass of a hydro turbine provides natural inertia to the electrical grid, maintaining a perfectly stable frequency. But Nepal offers a second geographical advantage that drastically alters the operational expenditure of a data center: the altitude.
Well, this is the part of the text that really highlights the physics of the problem.
Yeah.
Because data centers are essentially massive heat generators.
Yes, they are.
You put 100,000 GPUs in a room, and you have essentially built a giant industrial furnace.
Thermal management is arguably the most complex engineering challenge in modern computing. Cooling those servers represents one of the largest ongoing operational expenses, or OPEX, for any technology company. The industry tracks this efficiency using a metric called PUE, or power usage effectiveness.
So if I remember correctly, a PUE of 1.0 would mean that exactly 100% of the electricity drawn from the grid is going directly into the computer chips with zero waste.
Yes, and that is physically impossible.
Right, because of thermodynamics.
Exactly. A typical commercial data center might have a PUE of 1.5, meaning for every megawatt used for computing, another half a megawatt is required just to run the massive mechanical chillers, water pumps, and air handlers to keep the chips from melting.
Which is incredibly expensive.
Insanely expensive.
Yeah.
But by placing these data centers in high-altitude Himalayan locations, you leverage the natural environment. The ambient temperature is incredibly low year-round.
You essentially bypass the need for power-hungry mechanical refrigeration. You just pull in the freezing mountain air, filter it, and blow it across the server racks.
It's free thermal management provided by the local topography.
That's brilliant.
The industry terms that free air economization. It can drive the PUE down to near 1.1 or 1.05, which, at a scale of 50 gigawatts, translates to tens of billions of dollars in operational savings over the life of the facility.
Tens of billions, wow.
And geographically, placing this infrastructure in Nepal positions the country strategically between India and China. The text argues this makes Nepal the inevitable green compute hub for all of Asia.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if we look at the underlying math of what they're actually proposing to do with this 50,000 megawatts, it changes the entire economic model of a developing nation.
It does. It completely rewrites it.
Historically, when a smaller nation develops massive hydropower, they export the raw electricity to their larger industrialized neighbors via high-voltage transmission lines.
Right.
But the text explicitly states that while some power will be exported, the vast majority will be dedicated to domestic high-value AI compute. The way I visualize this is, it's like exporting raw electricity to India is like a farmer growing wheat and selling raw flour at a few cents a pound.
That's a good analogy.
The margins are incredibly thin, and the real value is captured by whoever processes it.
The author uses a very specific phrasing for this. The goal is to turn low-margin electrons into high-margin intelligence exports.
Right.
By building the data centers inside Nepal, next to the dams, you are keeping the value add within the country's borders. You take your raw flour, you hire a master pastry chef, and you sell a premium artisanal cake.
You aren't selling the energy. You are selling the computational output that the energy creates. And the value difference between selling a megawatt hour of raw electricity versus selling a megawatt hour of AI inference capability is astronomical.
It moves the nation's primary export from the utility sector directly into the highest echelons of the tech sector.
But having the water in the mountains is only step one.
Right.
This leap in logic demands a massive reality check. We just established that Nepal currently operates fewer than 4,000 megawatts of capacity.
Yeah, a tiny fraction.
Building out 50 gigawatts of high-head hydropower, tunneling through incredibly complex and fragile Himalayan geology, and simultaneously standing up the most advanced AI data centers on Earth is an engineering feat that borders on the impossible for a nation without an existing mega-project supply chain.
The sheer volume of concrete, steel, high-voltage cabling, and specialized tunneling equipment required is staggering. Nepal simply does not have the domestic industrial base to fabricate those materials or the logistical capacity to deploy them at that scale.
Which means this project cannot happen in isolation.
Exactly. It requires an external industrial engine. And this brings us to the second ingredient in the cocktail. The text is very clear that this must be a globally integrated project from its inception.
Right.
The terrestrial foundation of Himalayan Compute relies entirely on deeply integrating the engineering, supply chain, and policy frameworks of India.
India brings the exact heavy engineering profile required. I mean, they have spent the last several decades successfully executing massive infrastructure projects.
Dams, thousands of kilometers of high-voltage, cross-border transmission lines, and complex logistics networks.
Plus, they have a rapidly accelerating semiconductor and AI ecosystem themselves.
The author names specific corporate anchors that possess the necessary balance sheets and logistical reach to execute this. Entities like Reliance and Tata are cited as the scale of partner required.
Which makes sense. You need giants.
Absolutely. While Indian companies have developed projects in Nepal previously, scaling up to 50 gigawatts requires unprecedented cross-border coordination. You are effectively merging the electrical and data grids of two sovereign nations.
I found the author's framing of this bilateral relationship absolutely fascinating. Because they don't just rely on geographic proximity or trade treaties.
No, they go much deeper.
The text places this entire partnership under a specific historical and cultural umbrella, Bharatvarsha. The author writes, and I'm quoting here, Nepal is not India. Nepal is Nepal. But both Nepal and India are Bharatvarsha.
It is a profound use of shared cultural memory to bypass modern bureaucratic friction. And, as we analyze this text, it's vital to look objectively at how the author employs this ideology.
Right, maintaining strict neutrality here. It's a strategic framing.
Exactly. The concept of Bharatvarsha encompasses the broader historical and civilizational footprint of the Indian subcontinent. The text points to deep scriptural and historical ties.
Like kings from Nepal fighting in the Great Mahabharata War.
Or the annual procession from Ayodhya in India to Janakpuram in Nepal during Vivaha Panchami.
So the author is essentially arguing that modern national borders, which often act as massive friction points for customs, tariffs, and labor movement, should not obstruct a project of this scale, because the underlying cultural DNA has been integrated for thousands of years.
They are utilizing ancient trust to build futuristic infrastructure.
Which is quite a concept.
The objective here is pragmatic velocity. Mega projects of this scale typically stall in the permitting and negotiation phases. By framing the project as a joint civilizational endeavor, the text insists that Indian entrepreneurs, corporations, investors, and policymakers must be deeply embedded from round one.
I'd actually push back slightly on that assumption on behalf of you, the listener. Let's look at the standard model of sovereign development.
Okay.
Usually, a country secures its own funding, builds the dam, and hires foreign engineering firms simply as contractors or vendors.
Right, as a service.
They pay a fee for the service, but they keep the equity and the operational control entirely separate. Why does the author insist on deep, structural Indian integration at the very first round instead of later as a vendor?
Well, if you look at the forensic history of why massive infrastructure projects fail, it is rarely due to a lack of engineering capability. They fail because of a lack of coordinated policy, massive supply chain bottlenecks, and the absence of guaranteed revenue. The text argues that bringing Indian corporate giants in at round one provides three structural pillars that de-risk the entire $175 billion endeavor.
Let's hear them.
First is policy alignment. You cannot build transmission lines across a border if the two governments haven't synchronized their grid protocols.
Right, that makes sense.
Second is supply chain prioritization. When global materials are scarce, having an entity like Tata involved ensures your project gets the steel and the turbines first.
Because they have the buying power.
Exactly. But the third, and most critical, is the offtake agreement.
Ah, right. An offtake agreement is basically the lifeblood of infrastructure finance. If you are going to spend billions boring tunnels through mountains and buying tens of thousands of GPUs, the bank needs to know who's going to buy the product before you break ground.
Exactly. India currently possesses one of the fastest growing domestic demands for AI compute in the world, yet they face severe domestic energy constraints.
They need the compute, but they don't have the juice.
Right. By locking in Indian corporate giants at round one, Himalayan Compute secures massive binding contracts to purchase the compute power the moment the data centers go live. It guarantees revenue from day one.
It flips the traditional risk model. You aren't building a 50-gigawatt facility and hoping you can find customers to fill it. The customers are physically building the facility with you because they are desperate for the output.
Yes.
The text is incredibly unsentimental about this dynamic. The author explicitly states this is not charity or nationalism. It is pragmatic economics and strategic partnership.
India secures a massive, stable, green compute supply to fuel its domestic tech sector without overburdening its own electrical grid. Nepal gains a transformative influx of capital, high-tech infrastructure, and recurring revenue.
It's a win-win.
But this brings us to the most daunting mathematical hurdle in the entire document.
Money.
The money. India has the engineering capacity, but their domestic capital markets are intensely focused on their own internal modernization. You cannot finance a $175 billion decade-long mega project in the Himalayas using Indian retail banks or traditional project finance.
So we have the rivers of Nepal and the engineering of India. But scaling from under 4,000 megawatts to 50,000 megawatts requires a level of capital that traditional funding simply cannot provide. The scale of the capital required is, almost difficult to conceptualize.
It really is.
The text estimates the total capital expenditure, or CapEx, for the full 50-gigawatt build-out at roughly $100 to $175 billion.
That breaks down to an average of about $2.5 million for every single megawatt of capacity.
And that covers the massive civil engineering for the dams, the fiber optic networks, the data center shells, and the incredibly expensive AI hardware inside them. To find a liquidity pool capable of deploying $175 billion without flinching, the author points directly to the sovereign wealth funds of the United Arab Emirates.
The author refers to UAE capital as the necessary financial rocket fuel. But the financial engineering detailed here doesn't assume someone writes a single check for $175 billion.
Right, that would be insane.
The text outlines an illustrative funding ladder designed to progressively de-risk the technological and geographical unknowns for the investors. It is structured more like hyper-scaled venture capital.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's walk through that ladder, because the jumps in valuation are breathtaking. This isn't building a software app. It's like funding a national utility company and a Silicon Valley tech giant simultaneously. It begins with round one, securing $100 million in funding at a $1 billion valuation.
That initial $100 million is pure risk capital. Its purpose is to secure land rights, complete the complex geological surveys required for tunneling in the Himalayas, secure those vital early offtake agreements from Indian tech firms, and most importantly, get a prototype facility of 10 to 50 megawatts live.
You have to prove the physics work.
Yeah.
You have to prove that you can harness a glacial river, power a GPU cluster, cool it with ambient mountain air, and beam the data back to Mumbai without latency issues.
Exactly. Once you prove that microscale model works, the risk profile drops dramatically.
Which triggers round two. And this is a massive leap, raising $1 billion at a $10 billion valuation.
At this stage, the project shifts from a prototype to regional scale, building out 1 to 3 gigawatts of capacity. You are laying the heavy transmission lines and proving you can integrate with the broader electrical grid.
And then we reach round three, which is targeting global scale and preparing the entity for public markets. The numbers here are just astronomical, raising $10 billion at a $100 billion valuation.
It's a steep curve.
I want to pause on this funding mechanism. You listening probably understand how traditional venture capital works. firms on Sand Hill Road pooling money to fund software startups. But why is the text so adamant that this specific capital must come from the UAE? Why not tap the massive tech funds in Silicon Valley or New York?
It comes down to a fundamental economic concept: the cost of capital and the time horizon of the investor. Traditional venture capital is inherently impatient.
They want their money back.
Fast. A VC fund is structured to return capital to its limited partners within a specific time frame, usually 5 to 10 years. They seek software startups because software has near zero marginal costs of replication. You can write the code once and deploy to 1 million users over a weekend.
Right.
They expect an internal rate of return, or IRR, north of 20 or 30%, and they want an exit via an IPO or acquisition quickly.
But you cannot build a hydroelectric dam on a venture capital timeline. I mean, the environmental studies alone can take years.
Yeah.
Boring a tunnel through granite takes years.
Precisely. Infrastructure of this magnitude requires patient capital. You need an investor who is comfortable deploying billions of dollars today, knowing that the real cash flow won't begin for perhaps 7 or 8 years.
Which is exactly what sovereign wealth funds are.
Sovereign wealth funds, particularly those in the Gulf, are structurally designed for this. They are not beholden to quarterly earnings reports or the typical 10-year lifespan of a VC fund. Their mandate is generational wealth preservation and geopolitical diversification.
The UAE is actively preparing for a post-oil global economy. They are aggressively seeking to convert their petroleum-based wealth into the foundational assets of the 21st century renewable energy and artificial intelligence.
They have the deep pockets to absorb the massive upfront capex without the project ever stalling due to a lack of bridge financing.
By utilizing sovereign wealth, Himalayan Compute ensures continuous execution velocity. They can order the tunneling machines, the turbines, and the GPU clusters simultaneously. But let's look at the ultimate financial claim the author makes. How does a $175 billion capital expenditure translate into the trillion-dollar valuation mentioned in the title?
If we go back to the math on the compute monetization, the text projects that at maturity, with dedicated compute capacity in the tens of gigawatts, the annual revenue per megawatt will reach $10 to $30 million.
Okay.
If we take the conservative side of that model, say you dedicate a massive portion of that 50 gigawatts to pure AI inference and training, the text claims a credible path to over $50 billion in annual recurring revenue, or ARR.
In the current financial markets, AI infrastructure and foundational model companies are valued at massive multiples of their revenue because the total addressable market is viewed as nearly infinite.
Right.
If you have a highly defensible, structurally advantaged physical asset generating $50 billion in high-margin ARR, applying standard tech growth multiples to that revenue credibly pushes the valuation toward the trillion-dollar mark within a decade.
It is a trillion-dollar empire built on gravity and melting snow.
A trillion-dollar valuation looks great on a spreadsheet. But how does this massive influx of wealth affect the ground reality in Nepal? We have to pivot here because $1 trillion on a Bloomberg terminal in Dubai looks very different from the physical reality on the ground.
It absolutely does.
Injecting $175 billion of foreign capital and heavy industry into a developing nation has historically been a recipe for immense socioeconomic destabilization, environmental degradation, and, well, massive wealth inequality. How does the author propose executing this without treating Nepal simply as a resource extraction zone?
The text is highly aware of that historical trap, and the author outlines a very specific and highly unusual resource distribution model to counter it. It is defined as an 80-10-10 split.
Let's break down the mechanics of that split.
The primary engine of the project receives the bulk of the power. Roughly 80% of the newly generated electricity is allocated directly to the sovereign AI compute zones.
So that is the commercial core that generates the massive ARR.
Yes. Then 10% of the power is diverted directly to Nepal's domestic grid, providing firm, reliable electricity to local homes, businesses, and light industry, immediately addressing domestic energy poverty.
Nice.
The final 10% is designated for export, selling the raw power across the border to India, which provides a steady stream of traditional utility revenue.
But the more profound structural shift isn't how they divide the electricity, it's how they divide the equity. The author details a unique wealth transfer mechanism built directly into the cap table of the company.
This is where the proposal creates a hybrid between hyper-capitalist tech infrastructure and sovereign wealth redistribution.
Right.
The text proposes that the government of Nepal retains a 10% equity stake in the overarching entity. But more radically, it mandates a 10% foundation share that is irrevocably dedicated to direct social impact and poverty alleviation.
When I read about the foundation share, it immediately drew parallels for me to the Alaska Permanent Fund or Norway's government pension fund Global.
That's a great comparison.
Those funds take the revenue from extracting a non-renewable physical resource oil and invest it to provide a continuous dividend to the citizens. But this is arguably more sustainable because the resource, the river, and the compute isn't depleted.
Exactly.
The author is very clear, reiterating that this is not charity or nationalism. It is pragmatic economics.
It is an incredibly pragmatic mechanism for risk mitigation. If you are going to radically alter the hydrology of major river basins, build massive high-voltage corridors through rural valleys, and import tens of thousands of foreign engineers, you will inevitably face local political friction.
You're going to have protests.
Absolutely. If the local population views the project as a foreign entity extracting their water to enrich tech billionaires in California and sovereign funds in the Middle East, the project will be paralyzed by political sabotage.
But by institutionalizing that 10% foundation share, you align the economic incentives of the poorest citizen in a remote Himalayan village with the valuation of the global AI market. If the AI data center succeeds, the foundation's dividend grows. You secure absolute local buy-in by making the population direct stakeholders in the intelligence export.
Let's look at the physical footprint required to execute this, though. The text identifies 3 primary execution zones: the Karnali, the Gandaki, and the Koshi River basins.
So what does this all mean for the physical build?
The engineering strategy relies on a mix of massive storage projects, traditional dams that can regulate water flow year-round, and run-of-river cascades.
Let's clarify that engineering distinction. A run-of-river project doesn't require flooding a massive valley to create a reservoir.
Right, it's much smaller scale.
Instead, you divert a portion of the fast-flowing river into a pipe called a penstock. Let gravity pull it down a steep elevation drop to spin a turbine, and then return the water to the natural riverbed. It has a significantly lower environmental and displacement footprint than a traditional megadam, which is crucial in the fragile geology of the Himalayas.
But the logistical hurdles of building either type of facility in these basins are immense. The text openly acknowledges the challenges.
It's not sugarcoating it.
No. The fractured seismic nature of the geology, the intense seasonal variability of the monsoon, the environmental impact on river ecosystems, and the sheer logistical nightmare of transporting thousands of incredibly delicate, incredibly heavy GPU clusters up steep mountain roads.
How do you even get massive GPU clusters and cooling equipment up a mountain? The infrastructure required just to start building the data centers functions as a massive macroeconomic stimulus in itself.
It does.
The author calls for infrastructure enablers. We're talking about blasting entirely new high-capacity road networks through the mountains and laying hundreds of kilometers of new high-voltage transmission lines. The text suggests these could potentially be funded by issuing specialized Nepal government bonds backed by the future revenue of the compute centers.
And the roads constructed to transport tunnel boring machines and server racks inherently become commercial arteries. They connect previously isolated valleys to major economic centers. The text refers to this as building national infrastructure as a byproduct of the compute initiative.
That's fascinating.
But to cut through the inevitable bureaucratic friction of an operation this complex, the author insists on a one-desk policy.
Which is essentially a centralized sovereign authority with the power to issue environmental, construction, and import permits simultaneously, right? Rather than forcing contractors to navigate dozens of conflicting local ministries.
It is the only way to maintain the velocity required to hit a 10-year operational timeline, and it allows the project to engage efficiently with a truly global supply chain.
Because it's not just India and the UAE involved here.
Right. While India provides the heavy engineering and grid integration, the text envisions sourcing the best technology globally. Hydro turbines from European or Korean firms, tunneling equipment from China, and the core AI hardware, the GPUs, through massive long-term contracts and prepayments, potentially leveraging India's burgeoning semiconductor ambitions to ensure they aren't squeezed out of the global hardware bottleneck.
So if we step back and look at the blueprint up to this point, we have mapped out a $175 billion terrestrial masterclass.
We really have.
We have the hydrological physics of the Himalayas, providing baseload power and free thermal cooling. We have the Indian mega-project supply chain executing the build. We have the patient geopolitical capital of the UAE absorbing the massive capex.
Quite the setup.
And we have a socio-economic framework that distributes the wealth to stabilize the local politics. It is a completely grounded, highly pragmatic roadmap for terrestrial compute dominance. Up to this point, the blueprint is an incredibly ambitious Earthbound project, but the author's timeline stretches beyond the terrestrial realm.
This is where the scope of the document breaks completely out of the traditional geopolitical framework.
What's fascinating here is I genuinely had to reread this section of the text several times to ensure I wasn't misinterpreting the author's intent.
It's a huge pivot.
The timeline and the ambition stretch beyond the Earth's atmosphere. The author views the entire 50-gigawatt trillion-dollar terrestrial build-out in the Himalayas as merely a foundational stepping stone.
Yes. The text introduces the ultimate phase of the blueprint, orbital intelligence.
I gotta play the skeptic here. We've talked about putting server farms in orbit. Is this science fiction or a credible roadmap? We have spent an hour dissecting the brutal logistical realities of laying concrete and running fiber optics in the mountains. To suddenly pivot and talk about putting server farms in orbit feels like a leap into, well, a sci-fi movie. Does the author present a mathematically credible roadmap for space-based data centers, or is this purely conceptual?
The author actually treats it as a strict mathematical and thermodynamic inevitability.
Really?
Yes. The text explicitly states that Himalayan Compute is being structured with space ambitions from the very outset. The projected timeline suggests that within roughly 10 years, the economics of space-based data centers will cross the threshold of viability.
But why? What is the physical advantage of putting a GPU cluster in orbit that justifies the unimaginable cost of launching it there?
It comes back to the exact same two physical bottlenecks that drove the project to the Himalayas in the first place: power generation and thermal management. But in the environment of space, both of those factors reach their absolute physical maximums.
Okay, let's start with power. On Earth, even if you cover an entire desert in the most efficient solar panels humanity can manufacture, you're fundamentally constrained by the rotation of the planet.
The sun goes down.
Right, you lose generation capacity for 12 hours, and you have to rely on massive chemical batteries.
But if you place a data center in a specific high-altitude orbit, like a geosynchronous orbit or a sun-synchronous orbit, you can position the solar arrays so that they are exposed to the sun constantly.
Constantly.
Yes.
Yeah.
There is no day and night cycle. There's no atmospheric interference scattering the photons. You have uninterrupted, absolute solar power abundance, delivering true baseload power without a single drop of water or an ounce of coal.
Okay, so the power generation makes perfect sense. But I want to dig into the cooling aspect because there is a massive misconception about the physics of space. People assume that because space is cold, cooling a server is easy.
That's a huge myth.
Right. But space is a vacuum.
Mm.
On Earth, whether you are in the Himalayas or a traditional data center, you use convection to cool things down. You blow cold air across a hot surface. The air absorbs the heat and it carries it away. In a vacuum, there is no air. You cannot use fans.
That is the core engineering challenge of orbital compute. If you run a high-performance GPU in a vacuum without thermal management, it will literally melt itself into slag in seconds because the heat has nowhere to go.
Wow.
In space, you cannot use convection or conduction to the environment. You can only use thermal radiation.
We have to radiate the heat away as infrared light.
Exactly. The engineering paradigm completely shifts. Instead of massive air handlers and chillers, an orbital data center requires immense, highly specialized radiator panels pointing away from the sun into deep space.
Ah, deep space.
Right. The ambient temperature of deep space is near absolute zero, meaning the temperature delta. The difference between the scorching hot GPU and the infinite cold of space is as large as physically possible in the universe.
So it's super efficient if you can build it.
Yes. While designing those fluid loops and radiator panels is a monumental engineering task, the underlying physics offer the potential for the ultimate frictionless thermal management.
But the bottleneck has always been launch costs. Putting mass into low Earth orbit has historically cost tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram. You can't build a profitable data center at those rates.
That is a catalyst for the 10-year timeline. The text explicitly points to the aerospace revolution currently underway, driven heavily by the SpaceX model.
Yeah, reusable rockets.
Reusable rocketry is driving the cost per kilogram to orbit down by orders of magnitude. The author anticipates that over the next decade, as heavy-lift vehicles like Starship become fully operational and normalized, deploying modular, lightweight compute clusters into orbit changes from a financial impossibility into a scalable math equation.
And the R&D required to design those orbital clusters, to engineer the massive radiative cooling panels, and to secure the launch contracts. That requires a war chest of capital that dwarfs even the initial $175 billion terrestrial build.
Which reveals the genius of the project's sequencing. You don't try to raise venture capital for an orbital data center today.
You'd never get it.
No. You build the terrestrial hydrocompute megastructures first. The billions of dollars in highly profitable, high-margin ARR generated by the mountain data centers on Earth serve as the internal funding engine.
The terrestrial profits completely fund and de-risk the transition to orbital assets.
The author describes it beautifully, visualizing a seamless bridge from Earth's rivers to space-based intelligence. You leverage the geography of the Earth to build the capital required to escape the geography of the Earth entirely.
It is a vision of absolute, unassailable energy and compute dominance. So let's bring this grand, multi-continental orbital vision back down to Earth and look at the final takeaway. Let's synthesize the sheer scale of the journey we've just mapped out. We began with the physical reality of Nepal's topography, the steep fractured rock and the kinetic energy of glacial rivers tumbling down the highest elevations on the planet.
Right.
We combine that raw potential with the massive civil engineering capacity, the cross-border grid integration, and the vital day-one offtake agreements provided by the corporate giants of India. We fuel that entire supply chain with the patient, geopolitically strategic sovereign wealth of the United Arab Emirates, mapping out $175 billion capital expenditure.
And we explored how that investment doesn't just extract resources, but fundamentally alters the macroeconomic reality of the host nation through the 80-10-10 distribution model and the irrevocable 10% foundation share.
Aligning global tech profits with local poverty alleviation.
Exactly. We detailed how turning raw water into high-margin artificial intelligence creates a credible path to a trillion-dollar valuation. And ultimately, we examined the roadmap that uses that terrestrial war chest to break the bonds of gravity, deploying server farms into the uninterrupted solar energy and thermal vacuum of space.
It's an incredible roadmap.
The author summarizes this not just as a business plan, but as a roadmap for national transformation via digital leaps.
If we step back and ask the core question, why should you, the listener, care deeply about a highly technical blueprint published in 2026?
It is because this text represents the bleeding edge of a massive paradigm shift, a fundamental global reorganization of power. We are witnessing the end of the 20th century paradigm.
Right.
For the last 100 years, geopolitical leverage was dictated by who controlled the physical extraction of hydrocarbons and who controlled the physical shipping lanes required to move them. We are moving from a world where nations fight over oil to a 21st century reality where sovereign alliances will be forged over the generation of clean, baseload energy and the physical infrastructure required to house artificial intelligence.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. A provocative idea that builds on everything Paramendra outlined in this blueprint. If we accept the premise that advanced AI compute is rapidly becoming the single most valuable commodity on planet Earth, a commodity more vital to national security and economic growth than oil, what happens to the established global order?
It's a huge question.
Will sovereign states that simply happen to possess immense natural geographic advantages, like incredibly cold ambient climates or massive, untapped, steep gradient hydrological potential, will they suddenly find themselves positioned as the new global superpowers? Will the remote, mountainous nations of the 21st century replace the oil-rich desert nations of the 20th century as the indispensable hubs of global wealth?
It is the defining geopolitical question of our time. What happens to the balance of global power when a country's primary, most lucrative export isn't a physical resource you can load into the hull of a tanker, but pure, disembodied intelligence?
It changes the map completely, because suddenly you aren't looking for pipelines and you aren't fighting over canals. You are looking at the topography. You are looking at the mountains, the rivers, and ultimately the sky. Thank you for bringing this incredibly complex, deeply fascinating source material to the deep dive today. Keep exploring, keep questioning the map, and we will catch you next time.